Hi, my name is Andrea Luka Zimmerman. I'm an artist and filmmaker, and my work is concerned with marginalization, social justice, and waywardness, and a search for radical re-relations between people, place, and ecology.
So good evening, everyone. So lovely to see you all here. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Karen Eslea. I'm Head of Learning and National Programmes here at the National Gallery. It's a really exciting event for me to bring this beautiful Caravaggio painting together with such an inspiring contemporary artist, and that's what Unexpected Views is about, asking contemporary artists to choose a painting and to talk about how it's relevant to their practice. Because the collection, we're so lucky to have this incredible collection, and it's relevant to all of our lives. It's just a matter of thinking about the themes that you can pull out. Also, thank you so much to Hiscox Insurance for sponsoring this programme. We couldn't do it without their support. So I'm really excited to introduce Andrea Luka Zimmerman, who is here with us this evening, and she's reader and lecturer in dramaturgy and devising for performance at Central St Martin's. I had written a really long introduction, but we decided that actually it's much more important that a lot of the time this evening is given to hearing what Andrea has to say. So all I'm going to say is that her work is really concerned with marginalisation and waywardness, people being excluded, social justice, and how we might reimagine a radical new society where people, place and ecology come together in a different way. And her work is in many forms. She's co-directed and directed 4 feature-length artist films and shorts, and she's exhibited internationally, including in London at Whitechapel and Bristol at Spike Island, and she's also co-edited several books looking at similar themes. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Andrea with us here this evening. And we are talking about this painting, perhaps Caravaggio's one of his most well-known paintings, Supper at Emmaus, which was painted in 1601. And I'm not going to say huge amounts about it because hopefully that will come up in our conversation. But Caravaggio was an amazing, from what we know, a character in life as well as in his creation of his art. So he lived life to the full, shall we say, and lived in a very dramatic way. So he was known as being arrogant, and he actually was taken to trial for murder and didn't back away from violence. He lived between destitution, but then actually also stayed in grand palazzos and lived a very decadent, luxurious life at times in his life. So he moved between sections of society in a really interesting way. And this painting was painted perhaps at the height of his fame and represents the drama and theatre of his work, and actually why people at the time and now find it so compelling and interesting. He draws us in with these incredible life-size figures and sense of drama and light. So this painting particularly, Supper at Emmaus, as I say, was painted in 1601 and represents the story of the third day after the crucifixion. So 2 disciples were walking from Jerusalem to a village then called Emmaus, and they were talking about the fact that the tomb had been found empty and discussing this as they were walking along. And they came across a third person on this route who was listening, and they didn't realise who they were walking with. And so this character invited them for supper, and you can see them here with the innkeeper in the background, symbolically in the darkness and everyone else in the light, because this is the moment of revelation when these 2 disciples realise who they are sharing their meal with. When Jesus, they realise that Jesus has come back after the crucifixion, it's after the resurrection, and then Jesus disappears. So this moment captures that absolute point of drama when they have this incredible life moment of revelation, of realising that Jesus is back amongst them. But I'm not going to say any more at the moment. I think we should move on to asking Andrea, you were very, very clear straight away why you wanted to choose this painting, and I wonder if you could tell us why.
So there are quite a few reasons. And should we show the clip?
Yes.
Can we show the fourth clip first? Sorry, we've lined it up all quite differently. So I want to just show a clip that will, and I take over from there. So.
Children, until they are educated out of it and are forced to accept the mystifications, look at images and interpret them very directly. They connect any image, whether from a comic or from the National Gallery, directly with their own experience. I showed a reproduction of the Caravaggio to a group of school children.
I think it could have been they stole the food. And one of them saying, I'm not going to eat it, it's stolen food.
And he's going, why not?
Something like that.
You think he wants to get up?
Yeah. He looks as if he's a bit
Just about to pass the table.
He's being all romantic and she wants to go away and do something. I think it might be Jesus.
What makes you think it might be Jesus?
Well, he's in the center of the table and he looks like he might be a leader of some kind.
Looks like a sheep's meat.
And, and they've got the food on the table there. Yes, but they haven't got bread or wine. Yes.
What do the rest of you think about him saying that it might be Jesus?
I don't think it's Jesus.
He's got his own opinion.
Could be.
Some of you think it's a man, and some of you think it's a woman.
I think it's a woman. I think it's a woman.
You can tell. Because she's got too fat to be a man.
It looks as though they're all going to jump out and kiss her, because she just sits there. And he's got his arm out to cuddle her, and he's jumping up to run round. I think it's a man. I think it's a woman.
I think it's a woman. There's no bristles even.
Yes, but he hasn't got any bristles.
He got a moustache.
Yes, but he hasn't got any bristles.
But no, not quite all, but most of the boys thought that he was a man, and most of the girls, you thought she was a woman.
I'm not sure.
And you said she was perhaps both. Because they were really looking and really relating what they saw to their own experience, they recognized something that most adults wouldn't. Without knowing the artist's name, let alone anything about Caravaggio's life, or the fact that he was a homosexual, they immediately saw how sexually ambivalent the principal figure was.
So this was a clip from Ways of Seeing, and when I was asked to choose a painting, I just had this painting in mind because I often think about, when I make a new work, I look at a lot of paintings, and so in my last film, which we're going to see some clips of in a short while, I came here again to look at paintings to get inspiration, and Caravaggio has always been a really big inspiration for my work. Also how I work with light and darkness. So I come at paintings from a really different way, so it's very visual without knowing anything about them. So I didn't know anything about this painting at all, other than knowing this clip from Ways of Seeing and what John Berger wrote about Caravaggio, which I would like to read because I think it's very related to my own work. It's not very long, and it's from And Our Faces, My Heart Briefest Photos, if anyone was interested. So John Berger was also a painter, and so he painted in the same place where Caravaggio came from in the 1940s, in the streets of Livorno, and he said, it was there too, so John Berger says, it was there too that I discovered that I wanted as little as possible to do in this world with those who wield power. This has turned out to be a lifelong aversion. The complicity I feel with Caravaggio began, I think, during that time in Livorno. He was the first painter of life as experienced by the popolaccio, the people of the back streets, the sans-culottes, the lumpen proletariat, the lower orders, those of lower depths, the underworld. There is no word in any traditional European language which does not either denigrate or patronize the urban poor in its naming. That is power. And for me, this is a really key moment about understanding power through the hierarchies of representation. And so there are 2 points which came together when I was asked about which painting to choose, and one was the binaries that we create around gender and how we read people and why we always have to, how we socialize to have certain attributes upon people that are looking a certain way because of the way in which we look at them. And then the second way is about how do we negotiate power and relationships of power through the visual representation, and how can we actually then use this knowledge to pry open a different space and re-inscribe or reframe or deframe another presence making. That's what I'm really interested in, and I think we need to show some clips.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting in terms of how Caravaggio painted, because he couldn't afford, but also probably knew the power of asking people he knew. He didn't pay his models, so these are just people that he would know, ordinary people, and actually again at the time caused controversy because these are ordinary people playing the disciples in this painting. So it feels similar, you know, those people perhaps on the edges but representing really important characters in this story. But we should look at some clips of Andrea's work to give you a sense. We're going to play them all together. We thought actually we prefer just to create an atmosphere of her work and give you a sense of all of it rather than keep stopping and starting. So we hope that works for you. So if we move on to the clips.
So there are 3 clips. The first one is from Here for Life, which is the most recent film. Then the previous clip is from Estate, a Reverie, which is 2 films previous, but they're very related. And then the last clip is again from Here for Life. So just so you know kind of where you are.
Stallions! 3, 2, 1. Back off!
You fish, you don't hunt fish.
It's the semantics of it, you know what we mean. The fish are going
No,
around,
it's not to
and
do
you
with
go
semantics.
you go after them with sharp objects.
It's not an argument.
No, it's not an argument, sorry, I don't mean my voice to sound like
It's an open discussion.
My voice sounds rowdy, but I don't feel rowdy in the slightest.
Let it fry, fish to fry, fish to fry, fish to fry, Santa Fe and fry, Santa Fe and fry, fish to fry, fish to fry, fish to fry. Why they got to lie when too many fish to fry? Satisfy, satisfaction, easy, manufacture, Rasta man a chant, ancient a chant, Baccarat is not slack, pussy and jazz suspended.
I'm afraid of annihilation.
You really do. I mean, you can't make it nice. Or anything, you can't paint it.
You can't paint it, it'd look ridiculous if you paint a brick.
What else can you really do to it? It's like I said, there's nothing really. At the end of the day, you can do it, except for if you could get some boxes and put on the wall and just put some flowers in between to make it, you know.
And then put the pictures up of everyone.
And then put the pictures up. Then that would make it look a bit nicer until you do leave.
Yeah.
So you know what they said. Time to go. And then they left flats of us here. Out of sight, out of mind. Well, we weren't, and we aren't. So you know what we said. We are here.
We're going to have a sore neck by the end of this.
Place your bets now, the race is off.
Singing low down, where the little green lanterns shine. Oh, maid, so you've done with the all but one, and she can never be mine. 'Twas right in the midst of art, June night with thunder dancing round. I spied her face by the fairy light that beats from off the ground. She only smiled and she never spoke. She smiled and went away. And when she'd gone, my heart was broken, my wits was clean astray. Oh, stop your ringing and let me be your Brooklyn bells. You'll ring all Goodman out to the sea before I wed one else. Oh, Goodman's farm is rank sea sand and was this 1,000 year, and it shall turn to rich ploughland before I change, my dear. And old Fairfield church is water bound from autumn to the spring, and it shall turn to high hill ground before my bells do ring. Singing low down, low down. Singing low down, low down. Singing low down, low down.
I always wanted to go to India, never managed it. I've done a bit of travelling. Never got to the one place I really wanted to go to. I went to Northern Ireland a couple of years ago, which was great. Strange place, weird place. You been there?
A few years back, when I was a little bit younger, I used to get more jealous than I am now. You mustn't be jealous of other people. That's what my father says. You don't know what they've gone through to get that. And you don't know what will happen to them in the future. Just make do with what you got. Anything else that you want, find a way to work for it. Work yourself out of the city, out of the slum. No, let them eat. Let them eat. My time will come to eat. You know, my time will come to eat.
Thank you so much for sharing those clips with us. It was a really interesting experience reading about this painting and watching Andrea's work again, and so many connections seemed to come. For example, I didn't know where Emmaus was and looked it up, and the disciples were on their way to a village which is known, the philosophy was that people with learning disabilities lived in an integrated way in the town and cared for each other, which I didn't know about this painting before, and actually it seemed pertinent to lots of your work, that way of living together and caring, collaborating for each other, and particularly in Estate, which is about Haggerston Estate, which is where you lived, and this building was pulled down over several years. I think it was a long process, and you still live on that estate. I wonder if you could tell us something about how you collaborate with people and share with people to create your work.
So I never wanted to make work in the place where I lived, but because when I knew the estate was going, I realized, oh my God, you know, what actually is this place that I'm living in? Because it was the most extraordinary place, which there are many communities are like this, right? So this is not the only one, but you don't really look at your own place unless you know it's going, I think, sometimes. So I realized there was a hairdresser on the estate, which I clearly don't use, right? But her youngest client was in her 70s. So she was serving a very important function for people on the estate. there was a food coop which still sort of exists, but the food coop had existed since the 70s already, and then it was always closed down, then it was reopened, was closed down. So there was this incredible looking after each other, also structurally, where people could live. It was one of those places where people were dumped, including me when I was first offered a place there in a hard-to-let flat. And hard-to-let flats, they were called when people had turned them down, like 4 families had turned them down or something. So they were notorious sink estates, but they were actually really incredible community places because people from all over the place lived there. And it was a temporary space, but people had been there for 30 years by the time we all had to move away, right? So it was a long-term temporary space, which meant that we made the space together, so nobody had really ownership, but we wanted to make it as pleasant as possible while we were all there, which meant that table tennis tables, picnic tables, paintings were done inside the courtyard, and people would really communicate and talk to each other. It was such a beautiful place, I can't really quite describe it, and it was the only home that I've ever had, because even when I was a kid, my mom was traveling, she had a lot of problems. So I never lived in a place for a very long time, apart from in that place, and so when we were losing it, we really fought to try and keep it, but then anyway we lost it. So I knew I needed to make a film to have a memory of this place and all these people who lived there. And you know, there were people struggling with serious health issues, but there were no advocacy workers anymore. It was the first round of cuts that happened before austerity, which meant that loads of work was done by the neighbors for each other. But at the same time, you know, there were people who literally couldn't leave their flat on the 4th floor if they wouldn't have any neighbors, of which there were very few when they put all the orange boards up, because they literally forced people out who were in short life housing. So you had a few neighbors left who were looking after the other neighbors which couldn't go and buy food for themselves. And there was no structure that would come, no social services that would come. And I don't know if anyone of you has experienced trying to get hold of social services. It's not easy. It's not easy. So, so there were a lot of these kind of issues, but there were also like incredible caring and tender relations because of that as well. So you would feel like you could go somewhere and be safe there. So it was also a safe estate for young people to come in if they had gang trouble, for example, and people would look out for them. So I learned a lot from my neighbors and how to care for each other and how to look out for each other as a community. Indifference, and I think that's really important to really watch out for those people who are also not part of your direct experience, but you really learn to encounter each other, and I think that's what London was always so special for me living. So when I started filming, I also filmed all the meetings, everything that went around it, but in the end it was really about showing a counter memory that was existing regardless and because of these structures, and regardless and otherwise, I mean like you know, all representation of working class lives or immigrant lives are often done by people looking, oh, we need to help these lives. You know, these are lives that haven't got very much. And some of the people had a lot of money, they had really good pensions, they just chose to live in a different way. And I think these kind of lives have to be allowed also, right? So there's a really complex and nuanced way of looking at stuff. That on the one hand is structural, but on the other hand is also, are we actually allowing people to be who they want to be? So I wanted to show this counter memory and to make for me, culture is a way in which we can express these difficult questions, but also celebrate each other and celebrate the lives that are marginalized on purpose, often also in order to enforce structural change, such as like, you know, like people on this estate. I remember when the 2008 economic crash happened, it immediately, all around Hackney, it was bus stops, benefit fraudsters, we're going to get you. So it was our community that was completely misrepresented. And the first phase of redevelopment, so they had like a hoarding with all the stock photographs, and it looked like royalty. You know, so the faces, real faces, just become absent from a place. And so as a filmmaker, for me, what's really important is to try and understand the sense of belonging or not belonging, or the sense of encounter or disencounter, what makes me strange from my neighbor. And to try and understand it is very hard to put into words. So I wanted to make this film that was made collaboratively, but also really probed. So we had loads of workshops, we had loads of questions, people came in with proposals, and so it became this mishmash of stuff, looking at architecture, looking at gender, looking at racism, looking at anything you can think of, and we were discussing it. And out of that came scenes and came documentary footage, but also long-term observation, historical reenactments, where the costumes didn't quite fit, because it doesn't really fit us history. History is always much more nuanced than even historians, because they only come also from a certain perspective. And for me, what was important about this was we cannot make history by ourselves. We have to have all these different voices and a multiplicity of voices to make history really alive. Otherwise, it's just one power, a history of power, which is just not sufficient.
And it's so lovely to hear you saying that in front of this painting, which obviously painted the people are the life size, and we're being the disciple here, and it's assumed that this is Peter. He's kind of holding out his hands to welcome us in, and almost if you see the bowl of fruit sort of teetering off the table, inviting us to grab it and to be part of this scene. It's a very generous painting that invites us to be part of this moment of revelation. There's a real chime also with how you speak about different people coming together. It was very controversial at the time for the disciples to be painted as ordinary people, but this really important moment has ordinary people inviting all of us to be part of it, and a community to be made up of all sorts of different people and to share things together that really matter to us all. So it feels there's a real correlation with the things you're exploring. I think in your films too, you get this lovely, it's quite hard sometimes to understand whether people are being themselves, whether you're observing them, whether they're playing a character, particularly in Here for Life. People seem to move in and out of different kind of senses of themselves. I wonder if you could say anything about that.
So I think for me what's really important also is it's an overlap. Like we are not just one personality. We are so many different things depending on which situation we're in, which environment, who is encountering us, whom are we encountering. And so there are these slippages of us against the world and rubbing against the world. And I'm interested, I guess, in when people become part of the self-representation but also challenge the representation, like language, right? So we use the same language and it can mean completely opposite things, like Umberto Eco said that. And we see this a lot in politics. So we say one thing, but actually we can just say we have democracy. It doesn't really mean anything, right? But language is so important. It's so important because it's through language also that we understand, perhaps we can name something or unname it. So for me, filmmaking, in Here for Life, and there are two people who are really influential also in the film here, it's Therese and Gareth that sit over there, in case later you want to see them. So I didn't want to point you out. But there's a way in which people also have to have agency, I think, in my work, to participate in their own representation. And that doesn't just mean, okay, I'm going to play a person that I see in Benefit Street or that I see in a costume drama. It just means what are the kind of people that we think we can be. It's a rehearsal almost for a different way of life. That's how Adrian, who I was co-collaborating with on the Adrian Jackson on Here for Life, he does forum theatre, and forum theatre is a very radical theatre practice developed by Auguste Boal, and it's really beautiful because it evokes, I guess, the practice of living in a different way. So you have like legislative theatre and all of sorts of different kind of opportunities to make the world otherwise and to make this into a film. So for me, it's really important to find a way of expressing that is dreamy, poetic, gesturing outwards, but also questioning at the same time. So because it's a very emotional medium, film it's not just it goes both from the body and the mind, right? And it can do only that which film can do. So I'm interested in cinema in that way as well, even though there may be documentaries. So they have to go beyond that initial something. And that comes magnificently only if you allow an open space to work with people, because they will push this space so much further than one can as a director even, or as a writer, I think, imagine it. So you open it up rather than close it. And I'm interested in people for that, in real, what's called real people, but like people who are not performing to be somebody else by observing them, but people who are performing somebody else by also being, inhabiting, having the body of somebody who has the scars, I guess, of life, which we all have. And I think we need to have them more openly, because the more vulnerable we can say we are, the more kind we might be with each other, or tender with each other in a way.
And that's a really lovely, I think the last clip that we saw that was from Here for Life, where Richard, and I don't know the name of the other man, Patrick went to Dungeness, and we see them in the boat, and the whole atmosphere changes, the light feels different, there's a sense of air, and Richard said something about not being jealous of other people, and I know working generously and is working in moderation is very important to you, and having a kind of measured and balanced way of working. And he sort of articulates that so beautifully. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that scene.
I mean, I think also why I'm interested in Caravaggio and the people now I learn a lot more about Caravaggio, because it was purely visual, as I said early on. But I think what's really important for me is that film, for me, often is so excessive. It uses an apparatus that is very excessive. And I really love cinema, right? So I say this with it's a very complex relationship I have to it. And I think it has to be modest too, in a way, because I cannot justify working with the people I work with and then having an apparatus that is wealthy. I think, we have to spread stuff in a way. We can, the camera I used for Here for Life cost £500. And it's shot, I think, quite beautifully, right? It's possible, everything is possible and I have this will, right? I want to just prove always that I can do anything if I have the chance. And in Here for Life, it was more important for us to have people paid over a longer period of time so we could work with them for longer than to spend it all on cameras and work with people less long and not have so much of this process. And that was a real gift because it was a commission from Art Angel, so we had the space and the time and the support, which was very beautiful. But I think in terms of working with people, it's important that we can do a lot and we have to open culture up. I think in a way that doesn't mean that we have to work on minimal budgets all the time, but we have to spread the good news out. We can't just have a few people make something. I think we have to be properly radical about whom we're inviting to contribute to culture. It has to be much more open than it is. I really do think it's important, otherwise we become more impoverished. And we have to have a lively conversation, I think, also around what constitutes culture, what constitutes representation. We don't have enough of these kind of conversations. So I think in my working practice, I usually have to work on very low, modest budgets because it's process-driven and it's very hard to find funding for process. Even though I know in the end there will be something that will be a film, but funders can't easily fund it. It's just the system that we have. Exists either like this or like this, but the in-between, which is the most interesting, doesn't really quite yet exist, and it will one day, hopefully. So, but also I'm drawn to working on my feet because that means I'm flexible and I can actually spend time to find out who do I want to work with instead of having to just hire people to make my vision alone. I'm not so interested in that. I'm much more interested in inserting myself in a space and finding the right questions, I guess. It's the hardest, I think, is to find the right questions to ask of the world and the people you work with. And then the questions come out through the people you work with into the work. And then it will work. I mean, it will work as in it will do its work, I think, rather than just be an object for decoration.
And we were having a conversation earlier, weren't we, about, I guess, those spaces for people to have genuine discussions and how we've set up quite hierarchical structures that enable certain people to have more agency and voice their opinions more than others, perhaps. And it brings us really beautifully back as we need to draw this part of the conversation to an end, but to that John Berger clip at the beginning, and the children who actually often are seen in a certain way and that we think we have to teach them, actually within a few seconds they'd picked up on this really interesting kind of gender fluidity of Jesus in the painting, which, as I say, did offend some people at the time, because he was represented in a very different way, and those children, because they were given that space and we were listening and you were interested enough to show that here, we get a very interesting opinion straight away and a different point of view.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, because this is how important it is, even though knowledge is important, but it's also important that knowledge is questioned all the time, and it seems so obvious, right? But when we see then kids refresh something we know, it's really important. It's what makes us be alive, like in a different way. So I really always welcome that kind of that question, and that a non-assumption, non-socialized, non-yet socialized assumption into narrow pathways.
Well, maybe that's the perfect point to thank Andrea Luka Zimmerman for her really interesting insight into her own practice and this beautiful Caravaggio painting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for watching, and if you would like to know more, please click on the link below.